Hello and welcome to our web chat on the realities of Treasury outsourcing. My guest today is Pat Leavy, CEO of FTI Treasury, a leading supplier of outsourcing services. And we're going to be focusing on the realities from the supplier point of view. Before we begin, Pat, what is Treasury outsourcing as far as you're concerned? What does it mean?
Your opening question actually is the key question, and it is what we understand Treasury outsourcing is. And essentially and simply, all it is a third-party service provider undertaking part or all of a Treasury process. And the key word there is process. What it is not is also important to describe. Treasury decisions in an outsourced solution are always retained in-house. And all that has been outsourced is the process itself. And what has to happen then is that between the client and the service provider, an agreement on how that process works.
So if we look at the drivers and the benefits, what is the key driver in your experience for going to Treasury outsourcing?
Well, interestingly, if you look at the range of different types of organizations that engage a Treasury outsourcing service provider, one of the biggest group of companies are companies that have an international requirement for either a regional treasury center or some sort of finance company. And this is typically, for example, maybe a North American multinational corporation who wants somebody else to manage their non-domestic cash and treasury activities.
I often thought, though, the driver was getting a cost down. Is that not the case?
Indeed, for some other organizations, there can be a cost driver or there can be a gap driver. So, for example, they may have a gap in expertise, they may have a gap in technology, or there may be a requirement to reduce costs. In that example, a model that we see deployed is where the corporation undertakes the transaction execution themselves. In other words, they manage their cash, they execute their foreign currency and everything else attached to that. And then they might use the service provider's technology, and the service provider might run the non-core activities, for example, the back office and the treasury accounting. So in that situation, it means that the costs associated with the non-core activities are being reduced.
So is that the major benefit? I see several other benefits in your list here. What are the other key ones?
Well, interestingly, I suppose if anybody's ever undertaken a review of the time and effort spent within a Treasury organisation, it's always the same answer: 80% on operations and 20% on strategy. So by outsourcing the non-core activity, which is really technology and back office operations and the Treasury accounting, that effort can shift. In other words, a lot more time and focus can be spent on strategic matters and managing risk, and a lot less time on the process because you've transferred that responsibility and ownership to another party.
Is also the availability of expertise, because small treasuries quite often don't have a range of expertise. How does that play in the benefits?
Yeah, I think there are a group of companies, and probably mid-cap sized companies, who, because they are international, multinational corporations, require a best-in-class treasury operation, but they may not be in a position to have the full suite best-in-class treasury that they would expect. Or, for example, we found certain organizations that may be located in locations where it's difficult to obtain local expertise. So in those two examples, again, in that instance, there is an incentive where a full treasury outsourcing solution can be deployed. So in other words, they might have a CFO or a group treasurer. They're making all of the decisions, but they are using a third-party service provider like ourselves to run the process and manage the cash, undertake the FX, and look after all of the intercompany and provide all of the reporting framework behind that.
There are, however, considerable concerns across the industry and across corporate treasury departments about outsourcing in general, and what are the key concerns here, and how do you counteract these concerns? Because they're major concerns.
And I think it's fair to say that the concerns that people express are legitimate concerns, but there is a question of understanding. And the biggest concern that we hear people talking about is that they lose control. In other words, they think they are transferring the control of their treasury, and because treasury is so important at the corporate level, it gets so much oversight at the C-suite level that there is a view or a perception that control is being lost. But in practice, the reality is quite different because, and this was my opening remark, what is being outsourced is the process. The decision-making is still retained in-house. So, for example, when a process is outsourced, either the activities are being managed within an agreed framework. So cash management is cash management. Surplus cash investments is within an agreed framework.
The problem is deciding what is and what isn't, which is kept in-house and what is outsourced. That's a key problem, isn't it?
But what I'm trying to describe there is a situation where all decisions are actually kept in-house and then the service provider is running the process. And just as a simple example, in a lot of multinational corporations, the decision to hedge or not to hedge foreign currency is made at a subsidiary level, and Treasury operates as an in-house bank or an in-house Treasury organisation. So the decisions are within the corporation, but there's a centralised Treasury executing the transactions. And that in itself, if you think about it, it's all it is a process once the framework has been established from the beginning.
In that case, why have so many banks got out of the business? Because it seems a very difficult business to make profitable and run effectively. There are now few suppliers left.
Yeah. Well, there are probably two reasons why, in my personal view, that the banks have actually exited the market. And the first one is that I suppose when the concept of outsourcing started, Treasury outsourcing commenced about 25 years ago, there was a view that it was a big ticket item. There would be lots of companies willing to pay for it, and therefore the revenue stream associated with this from a product point of view for the bank would be significant. And that never happened. What transpired was the banks ended up with a low revenue stream. And the second reason then is the operational risk for a bank to manage a low revenue stream. Because in reality, organizations that outsource are not only looking for a process to be provided, but they're looking for an integrated, customized solution. And in our experience, our view of a lot of the bank service providers is that they were trying to productize the offering and not customize it. And that may not have met the expectations of corporations.
So if we move and look at the actual what you outsource, and the question really is, do you outsource part or all of your processes? How do people tackle this?
Well, there are different models to different types of organizations. I did suggest a minute ago that a lot of companies that have international treasuries look to outsource and their non-domestic treasury. So, for example, you might have a US company that sets up either a finance company in London or Dublin or Luxembourg or somewhere, or they may set up a regional treasury centre. And what they're interested in is driven from an activity perspective. So what they want is their non-domestic cash and foreign currency and very often intra-group type transactions to be managed. So they think about it from an activity perspective. But to run the activity, there needs to be the full treasury process, which includes the management and execution of transactions, the back office process, the checking, the confirmations, the reconciliation and the settlement, the accounting side, because very often in those instances, they might be statutory subsidiary companies. So there's management accounting and there is also statutory accounting to be done. And then their expectation is to have the whole control process and reporting framework in place. But the driver in that example is from an activities perspective. Other companies look at it differently and they look at it from a process perspective. So let's say, for example, and we would have clients in this category where they say, look, we will continue to execute around our own transactions, but we want to outsource the back office because we want to reduce our costs or our back office or availability of back office personnel is limited. So in that instance, they they look at it from extracting part of the process.
Is there a problem in terms of interfacing the two activities, so the two processes, because the front office is done internally, the back office is done, say, with you? There must be some management control issues.
So this model is a model that works quite well. And I suppose the key item that links the two is technology. So it's how you configure and present the technology is the catalyst of how well it works or not. So, and again, there are two ways of doing this. The way we see occurring most often would be where the client or the company uses our technology infrastructure and we maintain and look after that. They have remote access to it and they record their transactions over that technology. It means then from the service provider's perspective, they're in control of the technology infrastructure and they can manage the process quite easily. The other model is where the client has its own technology and is providing the service provider remote access to it. From our perspective, being the service provider, that is a little bit more difficult because we don't have the control of it. We're dependent on the client more so.
And there's the point you made earlier is that there's no single solution. Everybody is slightly different. Have you got any clients who do exactly the same combination?
So I suppose I'd categorize it into three categories. One is the FinCos, the finance companies or regional treasury centres, which it's a non-domestic treasury management activity. The second category then are companies who run their own treasury but outsource the back office and very often maybe the treasury accounting. And the third category is where companies, and there could be very sophisticated companies, they've already invested in technology, they have a stable workforce in their treasury team, but they extract a single activity, a ring-fence activity, and get somebody else to do it. And a good example would be intragroup netting. They may not have the additional capacity and they mightn't have the technology, and they say, look, let's outsource the technology requirement and the administration of the netting solution on a standalone basis. So I suspect that most parties fall into one of those three categories.
So, in a way, the future is bright for outsourcing as far as you're concerned, within the framework of who needs, the type of customer who needs this type of solution.
Well, maybe I'd describe it a little bit differently insofar as I'd say that for certain companies, it can offer an attractive proposition. For other companies, it doesn't, particularly companies that have invested heavily in technology and have a stable treasury team in place. But I think there is a bit of a gap in that the outsourcing industry hasn't really described clearly that what is being outsourced is this concept of a process, that there is that the control and the decision making is retained in-house, and there's very little risk on the outsourced service provider. So there is an onus on the industry to get that message across better. I think that's one of the bigger challenges facing outsourcing going into the future. But certainly, I think it would be fair to say that outsourcing does provide an alternative proposition for people that are looking to construct a solution to their treasury operations globally.
Pat, it's good to hear somebody being enthusiastic about treasury outsourcing. Too often it gets a bad press. Well, thank you very much. Most interesting.
Hey, thank you, Jack, and thanks for the time to have this conversation.